All right, thank you. Today I'll be refuting Annette's claim. I don't believe she's here right now, but
We're working without Annette.
that video games have a negative effect on adolescents, and I am simply proposing that video games, for the most part, have a positive effect on adolescents. She broke this down into three categories, and I'm going to attempt to use those categories: behavior, academic performance, and health. Now, first, she claims that through a study conducted of about 3,500 adolescents between the ages of 5 and 10, that these adolescents started to produce higher traits of neuroticism, disagreeableness, and anger and depression. Yet in a larger study performed through the University of Glasgow in the United Kingdom, which used a sample size of 11,000 children and adolescents ages 5 to 12, conducted a 10-year study which concluded that video games had no effect on behavior, attention, or emotional issues, where in fact television for 3 or more hours led to some changes, but video games did not. This study was also backed up by another 10-year study conducted with 13,000 participants below the ages of 12 through the UK Millennium Cohort. She then went on to claim that many children tend to model behaviors that they've seen in video games, such as violent behaviors, yet most psychologists agree that although they may learn these new traits or behaviors or characteristics, they're rarely expressed because typically modeling is through children is done through in-life role models such as teachers, parents, and other figures that we tend to hold up higher in society, not through fictional characters that don't play an active role in the child's daily life. And then she goes on to claim that children living in harsh environments usually turn to video games as an escape in order to attain a sense of acceptance and victory. And I actually claim that that's a great point, and I think that's a good use for video games. And most clinical psychologists would agree with this fact, because these tiny victories are what is used as the basis for addressing long-term depression and anxiety by slowly incrementalization, makes it move forward. Anyways, then she likes to address academic performance, and another study conducted, this time in Australia, through the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology was conducted using 12,000 teens and showed that these gamers actually scored 15 points higher on reading and math, and in fact 17 points higher in the sciences. And they went on to explain that this relationship between learning, sharpening, and applying new knowledge to these adverse problems is the possible reason behind these achievements. And then another study was performed by another cognitive researcher, and showing that gamers actually have higher attention spans, whereas she claimed that it was lowered and there's not as much brain activity within these individuals. Yet this can be shown with gamers having actually improved driving and more spatial awareness. For instance, taking in memory of locations of other vehicles in their blind spots or behind them where they do not have active vision. And gamers usually tend to do better at recognizing and remembering these things in the spatial world. Lastly, I'd like to talk about health. And she claimed that students who play video games have long-term negative effects on health. And I would like to say that if you do anything for a proactive, long period of time, you're going to have health effects with it. So, and I would like to point out that we would not be having these conversations right now if your kid was at home putting multiple hours a day into linear algebra or Sudoku or reading a book, for instance. Yet many of these same brain activities are stimulated by video games, and in some cases go beyond mere reading and little math games or even just mathematical practice. Now, I'd like to emphasize that, again, none of these are good for an extended period of time, sitting down, sedentary, but in effect, there's nothing more wrong with video games than there would be any other activity, even in the highest academic universities. So I'd like to leave off that video games are becoming more present in the world that we live in. Technology is rising, and there's nothing we can do about it. Today, about 90% of youth play video games, which, as any new form of entertainment, many people are going to criticize at first, saying, you're wasting your life, or very wary about their effects, whether it be on social skills, memory, or former skills that we no longer have. And the Greeks made this same argument with writing. For instance, they would say, oh, well, if you're writing, you're no longer going to be able to have the memory as we all do. But as we have learned throughout history, most of these effects have not destroyed human interaction and memory, and it is inevitable for this technological path to continue throughout society, and we have no choice but to be a part of it. Thank you.
There you go.
I don't know if you need this, I just used it for...
No.
But it was hers.
I do not. Thank you. All right, well, you start off identifying the structure pretty clearly, and you're basically going to be presenting counterclaims on most of these points. On the first point on behavior, you basically you tell us about the advocates resource that they used, and their study was 3,500 people, and then you come back with two studies of your own that studied 11,000 people and 13,000 people and did not find these kinds of issues that are being presented. So those are straightforward counterclaims. There's nothing that's necessarily demonstrated to be problematic about the advocate's evidence, but that there is information that seems comprehensive over a long period of time from two other studies that doesn't find that relationship. I think that does, try to deny the claim that the advocate's presenting there. On the modeling argument, you basically assert the notion that people in real life are going to be the more influential models. I don't get any information on that particular point. That's all an assertion on your point. On the issue of escaping and the small victories, you suggest that that's a good use of video games, and I could see your interpretation on that is a legitimate alternative way of looking at this particular point. However, you then assert that most clinical psychologists would say that this is the case. That's a complete assertion. I don't get any data on that. There's no authority that you're quoting. You're just assuming that we're going to agree with that. There's a second point here someplace, but it was not very clearly cited. I'm not exactly sure. I guess it applies to the academics. And basically, you just have a piece of evidence that talks about this one study that was done in Melbourne that got different results. There's no comparison to what the advocate's evidence was on this particular point. No reason why your information is more reliable, although your information is pretty solid. So although you've got a good counterclaim here, you need to do a little bit more contrasting for us and explain to us why your information is the stuff that's more viable. And then the last point on the health issue, you largely concede the notion that a lack of activity is going to be potentially problematic, and you suggest the same thing would be true if they were doing 6 hours of algebra in a row or playing Sudoku or reading. And I think that that's a reasonable press to make, except that my guess is that people aren't doing 6 hours of algebra in a row or reading or playing Sudoku, that there is something about the video games that is potentially more addictive and keeps people in their spot for a longer period of time, and they avoid other activities. But I don't know that the advocate presented that kind of argument. You don't really do much to countermand such an inference, so I think that that's probably the weakest of your responses there. All right, I do kind of like the summary argument. Says, look, it's just something new. People freak out about these things. The Greeks freaked out about writing, and we've lost the ability to memorize things. Well, that part's true. Memory is sometimes referred to as the lost canon in rhetoric, and I wonder why. Because we have access to writing, and it diminishes the need to memorize things. Maybe we should do that again. Get rid of your ability to read anything and make you memorize it. Let's do that for the rest of the speeches tonight.